Just about all aspects of pop culture go through a phase we usually call the nostalgia cycle. Something that a generation of people enjoyed as kids comes back into style and gets a second shot at life roughly 20 years later, when that generation of children grows up and becomes independent adults with their own disposable income. Since the video game industry is still relatively young in the big picture of all forms of media, this is a relatively recent occurrence. The first generation of kids to grow up with video games were in the late 1970s into the early 1980s. The era of Pong, of Space Invaders, of Centipede, Frogger, Q*bert, and Pac-Man. 20 years later, the late 1990s and early 2000s would be subject to the first nostalgia cycle that gaming would go through, with companies that were around at the time, like Namco, taking advantage by releasing a series of compilations of its old games, the famous Namco Museum series. Some companies acquired some of those earlier players, like we discussed in our Gauntlet Dark Legacy episode, like when Hasbro acquired the Atari name and intellectual properties so that it could contract out some modern-day remakes of classic franchises like Centipede and Pong. And Taito partnered with Activision to make a very successful remake of Space Invaders. One company that was very successful during the early 1980s arcade era was Midway. Midway had made its name in the early video game arcade era by being the company to capture the licensing and distribution for Japanese smash hits like Space Invaders and Pac-Man. But it also turned its focus towards making its own games as well, and its first major hit was a game called SpyHunter. SpyHunter was an action racing game putting the player in the role of a nameless secret agent character that was quite obviously inspired by James Bond. At least inspired by the driving and chase sequences in Bond films. It used one of the more advanced graphical effects of that time, having a very fast-scrolling vertical playfield that flew by, giving the sensation of speed. The fun part that separated this from standard racing games was the addition of weapons and combat, letting you blow your opponents off the road. This made it just as much of an action-adventure as it was a racing game. Ironically, considering our invocation of the nostalgia cycle, the original 1984 arcade game for SpyHunter itself harkened back to a cultural asset from the 1960s by using the theme song to the television show Peter Gunn, with its distinct musical intro recalling a slick, undercover private eye, the same way the Bond theme symbolized that iconic character. Being one of the more popular arcade games of the early 1980s, it would no doubt end up getting console ports, first arriving on the ColecoVision not long after its arcade debut, and then arriving on the NES in 1987. The same year, the original game got an arcade-exclusive sequel, SpyHunter 2, although that version would not get any contemporary console ports, and remained an arcade exclusive for decades. From here, this little two-game franchise came to a quiet end. That is, until the nostalgia cycle kicked in. By 1999, the retro remake craze was in full swing, with new and supposedly improved remakes hitting the PlayStation and Nintendo 64. But 1999 was also the year new consoles were starting to show themselves. Sony announced the PlayStation 2 on March 2nd, and development kits reportedly started arriving in the hands of third-party developers in April. So just a month later in May, IGN would report on one of the very first games it could that might be in development for the PS2. Midway Games announced that it had contracted with a development house called Paradigm Entertainment to develop a modern remake of SpyHunter, but declined to announce what platform it would be for. With the recent announcement of the PS2, and the reports they had that Paradigm Entertainment did possess PlayStation 2 development kits, IGN speculated this might make the new SpyHunter game a PS2 game in development. The other reasoning they had for this speculation was that Paradigm Entertainment had never worked on the original PlayStation, so starting now would be a bit odd and unlikely to make for a top-quality product on their first run with the hardware. But Paradigm Entertainment was a well-respected development studio with a number of games under their belt. So what were they doing in the meantime if they hadn't even touched the PlayStation? Why, they were working with Nintendo. In fact, they wouldn't even be making video games if it wasn't for Nintendo. When Nintendo was working up to the Ultra 64 back in 1994, its first partner in all of this was Silicon Graphics, who designed the graphics chipset for the system. Back in these early development days, Nintendo looked for companies that had experience with Silicon Graphics technology, and were introduced to a company called Paradigm Simulations, who used high-end Silicon Graphics computers for various contracts with much bigger companies, such as Disney, NASA, Lockheed Martin, and even the US Department of Defense. One of these was a realistic flight simulator that caught Nintendo's attention and got them in cahoots with the Japanese gaming giant. Paradigm would then work on tech demos for Nintendo to show behind closed doors, showing off the power of what its SGI-powered Nintendo 64 system could do. Paradigm Simulation would also work to create a software development system for the Nintendo 64 it called Fusion 64. With all this experience from its partnership with Nintendo, the company also worked to create one of the 2 launch titles for the Nintendo 64, since it was the developer behind the graphical showcase title Pilotwings 64, which borrowed considerably from their experience in making realistic flight simulators, something many reviews of the time noted, both with its realistic flight control and its cutting-edge graphics. On the success of Pilotwings 64, the game developing division would be spun off into an independent company called Paradigm Entertainment in March of 1997, and would then become an open gun for hire developer, specifically for Nintendo 64 projects. In fact, its next project would be an actual flight simulation combat game called Aero Fighters Assault, followed by a realistic racing simulation game with F1 World Grand Prix, and the critically acclaimed cult hit arcade racing game with still cutting-edge graphics, Beetle Adventure Racing. It was at this point that they were contracted by Midway to put together a SpyHunter reboot. This appeared to be a wise choice, since the studio had certainly proven itself at being talented with blending both enjoyable gaming mechanics with realistic and cutting-edge simulation-style graphics. The kind of thing that might make for a very good take on the SpyHunter franchise. As with so many other things, SpyHunter would first be officially unveiled by Midway at E3 2001, where the game was indeed unveiled for the PlayStation 2. With Midway going the extra mile to make sure that they recaptured the spirit of the original by contracting with the band Saliva to record a modern take on the original Peter Gunn theme, with both lyrical and instrumental versions as well as a music video being included on the disc. While a month after the show, IGN would report that Midway had plans for SpyHunter and its brutal arcade-style soccer game Red Card to come to the GameCube, Midway directly denied this, and it continued to remain mum through the rest of the year 2001. It wouldn't be until early 2002 that Nintendo would force their hand, perhaps simply by accident, or perhaps in a slight mark of desperation. Just a few days into the new year, on January 5th, 2002, Nintendo of America made a public posting revealing the Q1 releases for the GameCube. The headline-grabbing thing about this list was that the only Nintendo-published game on that list was NBA Courtside 2002, and thus, Star Fox Adventures and Eternal Darkness, which had been promised to be coming shortly after launch, were officially confirmed to be delayed, significantly weakening the system's momentum coming out of Christmas. For the purposes of our story today, the thing this listing also did was confirm that SpyHunter was coming to the GameCube, and soon. A week later, Midway would quietly confirm this, and just 2 months later, on March 12th, it would land on store shelves right alongside the Xbox version. Since this was just 6 months after that game had been released on the PlayStation 2, this pointed to a likely quickly rushed port. This is further backed up by the fact that these versions of the game were not being handled by Paradigm Entertainment, but were instead outsourced to someone we've seen before, Point of View, who we last saw handling the port of Smashing Drive. this little studio was evidently quite busy at this time, as they had Smashing Drive releasing in February, SpyHunter and NFL Blitz 2002 coming out in March, and Red Card Soccer 2003 releasing in April. And all 4 of these games were being ported to both the Xbox and the GameCube at exactly the same time. Let's see how that went. From just about the first moment after the credits, we see how it went, as we're greeted with a heavily compressed introductory video sequence that features some pretty apparent artifacting. This is also true for the gameplay loop that plays if you leave the title screen for too long. It's a fact of life that the GameCube's mini DVD is smaller in capacity than a PS2 or Xbox DVD, but we've also seen better compressed videos on the GameCube. These ones are reportedly actually running at half resolution and 320 by 240. We're then brought to the menu with a few choices. The dossier at the bottom is really just your gameplay record. The system options gives us the settings, which just has rumble settings, as well as all the audio choices, which includes both surround sound and headphone presets. The controller section just shows us what the controls are, no options to modify that I could find. The last area, labeled Extras, gives us a music test section, a list of all your unlocked cheats, and the videos that you've unlocked, fairly or unfairly. These are just videos of the intros to levels, and that music video from Saliva for the rendition of Peter Gunn's theme. All these pieces aside, you fire up the main single-player mode and get to choose the first mission, which sets up the game and the gameplay pretty perfectly, as it's a training course. You're on a track with a plethora of objectives, one primary and several optional ones. As you should expect in a game about piloting a sexy spy vehicle, the game will come down to your ability to handle and maneuver your car, which fortunately handles incredibly well. It's solid and responsive, and the game proves this to you right off the bat by having you dodge around sets of traffic cones and slalom through sets of land-based buoys. But it also makes sure you know this is an action game as well, as it moves right along to target shooting, with the added caveat that you're expected to only hit the marked enemy vehicles and leave innocent civilians out of your line of fire. Your super vehicle also transforms into waterborne and motorcycle modes, which don't really change up the controls or what your vehicle is capable of too much, but more so just add some variety to your play locations and play style. You're unlikely to get all the objectives complete on your first go, and you don't have to accomplish all of them in one run. It's a bit like the career mode to Tony Hawk games. You'll need to play again and again to get the map worked out and to practice each challenge a bit. But it's fun to try these challenges again and again, because the controls are tight and the premise of being behind the wheel of a spy car is just slick and appealing. Once you finish this introductory level, you get to move on to your first real-world mission, which puts you in a bit more of an open arena level. It's not quite an open world like a Grand Theft Auto City, but it's also not just getting from point A to point B linear like a racetrack either. You get to roam around the roads you're on, exploring the winding arena level, trying to find and accomplish each aspect of your mission. SpyHunter is an altogether tight and appealing package. It accomplishes full-on fantasy wish fulfillment in a very cool and very well-playing manner. The thing that needs to be addressed, talking about the GameCube version though, is that it's a pretty poorly optimized adaptation of the original game. It's not unusual that many, if not most, 6th generation games started on or were targeted to the PlayStation 2. But what is unusual is that they come over to the GameCube or Xbox with major graphical downgrades, since both of those systems are significantly more powerful than the PS2. While the Xbox version of this game got progressive scan output and turned on some of that system's graphical effects, the GameCube version appears to have been so straight and unoptimized a port of the source code that it doesn't even use some of the basic hardware effects of the GameCube, like texture filtering, as you can observe the road passing behind your car having some really heavy pixelation on the ground textures that even the original PS2 version doesn't exhibit that badly. It also has some glaring slowdown points in the frame rate that again do not crop up in the PS2 original. Of course, we noted the heavy compression of the video clips in the GameCube version due to the smaller size of the GameCube discs, but on top of that compression, It's also just missing several of the special features the Xbox and PS2 versions had, such as a little mini making-of documentary and another Saliva music video. It would be easy and also unfair to blame Point of View Software's abilities for the quality of this version, since they were also responsible for the Xbox version. More likely, this rush job appears to be more the result of an overworked studio doing basic triage and how it allocated its efforts between all these different games it was making at the same time. But that also creates the chicken and the egg scenario that Nintendo fans are fairly used to when it comes to many third-party ports. Do developers correctly surmise lower interest from Nintendo owners and appropriately allocate their lower efforts to inferior ports? Or do the inferior ports result in lower sales on Nintendo systems? This question may not be totally answerable, but what is quite clear is that once again, we have a sales loss for the GameCube here, as the PlayStation 2 version sold a whopping 1.67 million units compared to the Xbox's 340,000 units, and the GameCube once again bringing up the rear with just 200,000 units sold worldwide. As is the case with many bad ports, the underlying game is still great. If this was your only way to play SpyHunter, you wouldn't be disappointed. But if you have the option between this version and either of the other two, it would make far more sense to go with one of those. Which is a shame, since this is a really fun, stylish, and well-rounded game underneath the graphical and feature sacrifices that were made to bring it over to the GameCube.